that's what we'll just wait and do at the end. Alright, so that's why it was down here, we're like hiding it. Oh, that's not the video version though.
I'm Debbie.
Okay. So yeah, probably, yeah, I think so.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started with this next session, which is on wildlife survey design and analysis. Our first talk of the session is a recorded talk by Debra Palka, and she's actually on Zoom with us and will be here for the Q&A, so please do submit your questions for her if you have any.
I'll be talking to you about a comparison of visual and image aerial surveys. But first, I'd like to say thank you to Lisette Campbell, who did a lot of these analyses. And I also want to say thank you to Tetra Tech and Normandy, who did the collecting of these data. And of course, I'd like to thank the funders, the state of New York, and BOEM. Here are the track lines for the visual and digital surveys, as you can see.
Okay, I'll go back.
But first, I'd like to say thank you to Lisette Campbell, who did a lot of these analyses. And I also want to say thank you to Tetra Tech and Normandy, who did the collecting of these data. And of course, I'd like to thank the funders, the state of New York, and BOEM. Here are the track lines for the visual and digital surveys. As you can see, they cover the same general area and in the same time period. However, there are differences, such as the visual survey conducted monthly surveys at 1,000 feet, while the digital surveys conducted quarterly surveys at about 1,300 feet. In addition, there were other differences. For example, the visual surveys collected data in a swath that was about 3 kilometers on either side of the track line, and they targeted the large whales only. However, they did record sightings for all the species that they saw, and they also had a belly window video camera rolling. However, these data haven't been analyzed. In contrast, the digital survey, they collected data in a swath that was approximately 0.3 kilometers on either side, and they targeted all species within the 3.6 million images that they took. So here you can see a quick look at the number of groups and individuals that were seen by the two different types of platforms for the large whales. But because the survey regions are so different between the digital and visual areas, we really need to go all the way and estimate absolute abundance estimates in order to make a fair comparison. And that's what we did. For the two different types of data, we estimated the absolute abundance estimate using both design-based and model-based analysis methods. Now, to estimate the absolute abundance, we first estimated the surface abundance estimate and then corrected it for availability bias correction factor and also for perception bias. Now, for the digital data, we were able to estimate the surface abundance estimate in 3 different ways. One, a strip transect method, which is the ideal method since it's nice and simple, but it does have some assumptions that we need to validate first. We also estimated the surface abundance for the digital data using covariate distance sampling methods that were based on both groups and also on individuals. The bias correction factors do contribute a fair amount to the abundance estimate, so I'd like to spend a second talking about them. Now, the visual surveys did not collect any additional information to estimate this correction factor, so we had to use estimates that were collected from other surveys. Now, ideally, every survey should collect some information to help estimate what this correction factor should be. Now, for the digital surveys, they did collect some information that could be used as a proxy for the perception bias. That is, they re-examined 10% of the images that they thought were blank and looked for animals. And they did find a few animals. As you can see, the numbers in the table are not 1. However, ideally, it would also been good to re-examine some of the images that did have animals in them and see if there were individuals that were missed. Also, ideally, it would be nice to see if there were missing rates, if the rate of missing is specific to different sighting conditions. That is, under different Beaufort states, you'd miss different amounts of animals. Okay, availability bias. That correction factor is for the animals that were not present at the surface, like they were diving, and so we want to be able to add them in there. And so for both of the visual and digital survey, we use the same estimates, again, that were derived from other studies. Next, we use standard spatial modeling analysis methods on both data sets. That is, we use the covariate distance sampling results and the perception and availability correction factors that we estimated using the design-based methods. Then we compiled the spatial temporal environmental factors and assigned values to every 5 kilometers a segment of track line and to every sighting. We then threw this into a generalized additive model, and poof, we got relationships between the factors and the density estimates, and we also got the abundance estimates. In addition, we used the methods described in Miller et al. That incorporate the uncertainty from the detection function, from the generalized additive model, and also from the perception and availability bias correction. Next, I'll show you some highlights of the results. Okay. Here you can see the detection functions from image line transect analyses that are for the different species groups. Now, if the assumption for a strip transect survey were valid, then the effective strip half-widths would be 0.29. However, as you can see in all cases, this is not true. So what this indicates is that a strip transect analysis is not appropriate for these particular data. You can also see, particularly for the small-sized animals like a harbor porpoises, that the probability of detecting a group is different for different environmental factors like cloud cover, wind speed, and turbidity. So what this indicates to me is that the traditional covariate line transect analysis methods are more appropriate than the desired simpler strip transect analysis methods. Here are some results from the spatial modeling. This is an example of the fin whales, and you can see the circles are the locations of the sightings, and the colored spots below it are the estimated densities, where red is the highest density and dark blue is the lowest density. You can see that the two different data types, they provided a similar pattern. That is, that there's an accumulation around the 1,000 meter depth contour. And you can see that the variables that were used to create the models were actually quite similar. However, the abundance estimates aren't exactly the same, but given the CVs, they're not too bad. So here's another way to look at the resulting abundance estimates. You can see each column here is a different species: fin whale, humpback, and right whale. Each block of rows is for a different season: spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then within each block are the estimates of abundance, the point estimates, and the CV and the 95% confidence intervals for each of the different analysis methods, where the top 2 lines are for the visual data and the bottom 4 are for the image data. Now, in summary, what we can see is that for both the visual and the image data sets, especially when the densities are relatively large, the abundance estimates derived from all the analysis methods were generally similar, that is, at least within the confidence intervals. However, in seasons when the density was small, such as the right whales in the non-spring season, you can see that these gaps here are where there's no abundance estimates, and because there were no sightings. However, the spatial model did estimate a small abundance, which in this case is probably correct since the visual surveys did see animals during those time period. Here you can see the comparisons for a couple of the other smaller dolphin species. Now, these species were not a target species for the visual survey, so it's not fair to compare the results from the visual versus the image data. However, we can look at the estimates from the different analysis methods as applied to the digital data. So what we see is that the strip transect methods are often less than the density, the distance sampling methods. And we can also see that, particularly for these species that have large group sizes, the individual-based analysis methods result in slightly larger point estimates, NCVs, as compared to the group-based analysis methods. Now, this might be due to incompletely accounting for the effect of the overdispersion when basing the density, the sampling analysis methods on individuals instead of groups. So, to wind this up, what I got out of these analyses is we have a bit more work to do to get the most out of the image data. For example, we can estimate more survey-specific correction factors for the perception and availability bias. We will have to inspect the image data to test the assumptions to determine the most appropriate analysis methods. And although I haven't really mentioned it in this talk, I'd like to collaborate with any of you to develop AI algorithms to assist in finding animals in the images. Now, we've started this process by using Viami to develop some AI models, but we can get accurate models a lot faster if we collaborate. So, if you're interested, please give me a contact, and here's my email address. Thank you.
Next up, we have Kelly Macleod.
I need my glasses to see the screen, but you are all fuzzy, so maybe that's good. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Macleod. I'm from High Def Aerial Surveying in the UK, and I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on internally and collaborating with Ben Stevenson from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And we're looking at how do we estimate absolute abundance of harbour porpoise using data that's collected using our digital video aerial survey. So by way of background, currently surveys for estimating absolute abundance of harbour porpoise and other cetaceans in Europe are primarily conducted through the SCANS programme. The first SCANS survey was undertaken in the mid-90s, and what you can see is that originally these were ship-based visual surveys. The coverage in those early years is shown in blue for the ships, but what you can see is through time they've moved on to conducting the survey primarily from visual aerial survey methods. And the SCANS visual aerial methods, at least in Europe, are really held up as the gold standard. And that's because the project has implemented field and analytical methods to estimate abundance that is corrected for both perception and availability bias. They use mark recapture, distance sampling methods, and these indirectly employ mark recapture theory to surveys of unmarked populations. And this is achieved by conducting 2 independent counts within a survey area, and they create capture histories based on the location of animals and the time of detection in each of those counts. To be able to correct abundance for availability bias, those two counts need to be separated in time. And in the scans methodology, they've achieved this by using what we call the circle back method, where the aircraft will survey along a transect, a harbour porpoise is detected, the pilot gets a cue, leaves the transect, recircles back to create that time lag, and resurveys the same stretch of transect in an attempt to recapture or not the harbour porpoise that was sighted originally. And from that information, they can model capture histories and derive absolute estimates of abundance. So this program is well established in Europe, but now we're facing an ever-expanding spatially wind industry in the North Sea and wider European waters, and also turbines are increasing in size in the offshore environment. And that presents a real problem for programs like SCANS, which are dependent on visual aerial survey. So typically they're flying at about 600 feet for marine mammal surveys, even lower for seabird surveys. And so what we've seen in Europe is a switch from using visual aerial surveys to using digital aerial surveys, at least for surveys that are supporting the offshore wind industry. So for baseline characterization surveys and for pre-post construction. So, and that's because digital aerial surveys will typically fly at higher heights, and high-def surveys fly typically above 550 meters altitude or 1,600 feet. So I'll briefly show you the high-def survey rig setup. The schematic shows our 4-camera survey rig. Each camera surveys a strip of about 125 meters in width. The rig can be set up so that it's gapless, and you have a 500-meter strip width. The survey plane, as I've just said, it flies high, typically about 1,800 feet. And at that altitude, we achieve 2-centimeter ground sample distance. And the surveys are designed as strip transects, and density and abundance of cetaceans and seabirds are worked up from the data. Now, as Debbie has just nicely informed you all, that there's some assumptions in strip transect sampling. Fundamentally, it's assumed that all the animals in the strip are detected. But we know that's not the case. And so currently the estimates from our digital aerial surveys are biased low, and they are relative abundance rather than absolute. And that's really why there's been no uptake of this methodology for programs like SCANS, where the objective is to estimate absolute abundance. So for this project, we're just focusing on how to correct for availability bias, and that occurs because animals dive. Harbour porpoises, some of them at least, are underwater at the time of the survey. So we wanted to figure out how to collect data in the field and how to analyze the data so that we could at least remove that source of bias from our estimates. So using mark recapture as our starting point, we know we need 2 survey counts, separated in time of the area of interest. So we considered trying to achieve this separation of counts by putting on the same aircraft, trying to separate the cameras, perhaps 2 facing forward, 2 backwards. But actually, we can only achieve quite a short time lag by doing that. So we discounted that approach. We also can't implement the circle back method for digital aerial surveys because it relies on that real-time detection of harbour porpoise so that the pilot knows when to initiate that circle back to do the recounting. So we had to settle on a 2-aircraft in tandem approach. In this project, the aircraft were separated by a 3 to 4 minute time lag. And that long lag is really desirable because it allows estimation of that availability parameter and ensures independence between the 2 counts. But long lags and mobile species create an analytical problem because it increases the uncertainty in capture histories. And typically, marked recapture theory requires capture histories to be known with certainty. So the solution was to move away from methods that are dependent on knowing capture histories and to use a new method that is not. And we found a potential solution here. This is a cluster capture recapture method, and this treats capture recapture data with uncertain detection identification as a clustered point pattern process. The estimation framework is based in the Neyman Scott point process, is described in this earlier paper back in 2008 by Tanaka, and it has since developed through time. And the version we're using has been developed by Ben Stevenson. This cluster capture-recapture paper up there on the left. And conveniently, Ben put his method into the Palm package, and that's available in R. So that's very convenient to use. To date, Ben's method has only been applied to synthetic data, and that was generated by resampling real data from visual aerial circlebacks. So our aim was to collect some real-world data using our digital methods, but also do this coincident with visual aerial surveys so that we could make some comparisons. So the data collection took place back in 2022 in summer. We surveyed with 2 aircraft, the transect lines that you can see, and that's off the northeast Scotland. The survey block and the transects were designed by the Scans 4 survey, and they had a visual aerial survey occurring in this same block at similar time. Coordination between the 2 high-def aircraft is crucial because the whole methodology requires there to be a detection region, so an area that is covered by both aircraft and the camera rigs. So on completion of the project, of the field work, we managed to survey over 2,000 kilometers of survey effort. We had to do some processing of that effort data, so it was trimmed to effort conducted in both at sea state 4 or less. And we also had to look at the flight paths of the individual planes. We had to only use effort where both planes surveyed the same area. That's really important for this methodology. We got a good number of detections, 159 porpoise on the first plane and 180 on the second plane. And from these data, we got the exact location of each porpoise detection. And from that, we then had to determine the distance from each detection to the start of the survey. And it's these distances which are the basis of the point process method. And fundamentally, the distances across multiple detections of the same individual are more similar than observed values for different individuals. So observations from the same animal, therefore, form clusters. And you can see that in the map here. So some very preliminary results. As I've said, we flew the same transects as the visual aerial survey, the scan survey, and tried to coordinate in terms of timing. Unfortunately, the Scans 4 survey was a little bit prolonged and was piecemeal coverage on a variety of days. So unfortunately, that difference in timing of the surveys undoubtedly weakens our ability to make a comparison between these 2 survey methodologies. But I think what you can see here is that the estimates of density and abundance from the digital aerial survey and the Scans 4 are certainly comparable. There is overlap in those confidence limits, and interestingly, the estimate from the digital aerial survey is more precise, and you can see that in the CV there. Also, what we get out of the Palm method is an estimate of the proportion of harbour porpoises at the surface, and from this data set, the estimate was 27%. So finally, what are the next steps? Well, firstly, we have to take a closer look at the model diagnostics. what we have seen so far, although the results look reasonable, is that there may be some issues where clusters are not being recognized when there are detections at distances that you would expect them to be. Also, that proportion of time spent at the surface of 27% is, it seems high, and I say that compared to some of the estimates that we have from tagged porpoises in the North Sea, where they tend to spend between 4 and 10% of their time at the surface, about 40 to 70% in the top 2 meters. The other issue, again, which Debbie has touched on, is perception bias, and we didn't consider that in this study. Historically, digital aerial surveys were developed primarily for ornithology surveys, and perception bias was largely discounted because, you know, your camera is collecting the data, not visual observers. But actually, when your data are being reviewed by humans, then perception bias certainly enters the equation. So to take a look at that, what we intend to do, we already have an AI solution that detects objects in our video footage, the high-def find AI solution. So we're going to run these data set through the AI to make that comparison. And then finally, we need to work towards a single aircraft solution. You know, having 2 planes out there is costly, both financially and in terms of carbon emissions from having 2 aircraft. So we are continuing to work with Ben Stevenson over in Auckland and his colleague Rachel Fuster. And there's some more further development to do of the statistical framework, but ultimately we'll be working towards getting a methodology to estimate absolute abundance from the high-def data and from a single aircraft. So, thank you all very much for listening.
All right, next up we have Doug Sigourney.
Hi, so I'm Doug Sigourney. I'm a contractor at the Northeast Fishery Science Center, where I've been working with Debra Palka, who just talked, and some others, developing these Bayesian models, which have involved a lot of blood, sweat, and mainly tears. So it's really glad that I had this opportunity to be here and finally share some results. And thank you to the organizers for pulling this together and giving me an invite and an opportunity to share some of this. So some of you, I think, are probably familiar with AMAPs, but if you're not, this is sort of what funded the research and funds me. It's the Atlantic Marine Assessment Program of Protected Species. It's a pretty large-scale collaborative effort between the Northeast and Southeast Fishery Science Center, Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's mainly funded through interagency agreements with BOEM and the U.S. Navy, primarily BOEM. And sort of the heart at AMAPs are these broad-scale line transect surveys, where with a strong interest in wind energy areas. So wind energy areas aren't the only area of concern, but that's definitely a main driver behind AMAPs is collecting these data and figuring out, sort of predicting and estimating sort of what's going on in these areas. So there's many objectives, and they sort of evolved through time, and a lot of great work has been done through this program. Sort of where I come in as kind of a data analyst is to focus sort of on this goal of developing these fine-scale, spatially explicit density estimates. And kind of a sub-goal of that, in sort of the spirit of best available science, is investigating the statistical methods out there and using the most appropriate methods to basically derive the best estimates that we can. So I've probably heard a lot about this, and there's been a lot of great talks already, so I won't belabor it. But at the heart of this is using these density surface models as a way, as sort of a venue for taking this line transect survey and pumping out something that we can use in terms of making these predictions. There's been a lot of evolution in this field, and it continues. It's hard to keep up with. It just continues to change, so this is a little bit dated. But back in my day, sort of a common method was this two-step approach, right? Because we got to do something about the fact that when we go out there, we can't see everything. We have this perception bias problem that was already been sort of discussed. So we need to adjust for that. So generally using something like distance sampling, mark recapture distance sampling to apply to our line transect data, then maybe putting in an effort offset for the actual amount of, say, track line effort in the area of interest, and then connecting that finally to our habitat model, which it could be a general linear model, but GAMs, general additive models, which are a little bit more flexible, are usually more commonly used. So again, it was sort of common to sort of use this two-step approach where you get one part, you get your detection function, or you get the detection function, fix that, and then fit your density surface model. So what's the deal with this Bayesian hierarchical stuff? Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty here. I mean, it would be great if we could just go out and count everything, or it'd be great if we could go out and get really fine-scale, really precise estimates of our detection probability. But especially with marine mammals, there's just so many different components going on here that all carry some level of uncertainty in terms of just the detection function itself, or the distance that comes from the distance sampling. Of course, a lot of these animals are under the water, so you have to adjust for things like availability bias, and then you have your other whole component, the density surface model, that also carries uncertainty. So sort of the main motivation, at least when I started, was to be able to do this all in one step, to use this Bayesian hierarchical model so that we can propagate that uncertainty. And this paper over here, I don't know why I chose, I just kind of like the title, it has nothing to do with whales. But I like that idea of you want to know what you don't know, right? So yes, we want precise estimates, but we don't want to be overly precise. As somebody said yesterday, I think there's uncertainty in the uncertainty. So we want to do our best at getting that right, because things can really go awry if you start coming up with estimates that are overly precise. So that was sort of the goal, or sort of the motivation of trying to fit these Bayesian hierarchical models. I'm going to skip the nitty-gritty of all the details here, but this first paper that we published, that kind of goes into, that was sort of establishing the model, the hierarchical structure, getting GAMs, getting general additive models into that Bayesian hierarchical structure. And what we focused on there was this uncertainty. So how much does it matter? And so we would compare that to the sort of more traditional two-step approach, how much more uncertainty is propagated when you do it in this sort of one-step framework. But now that I have, these models are up and running, I really want to use them and, use the results. And another great thing about at least to me, about the Bayesian framework is that you can use it to sort of communicate uncertainty in different ways and express things as probabilities that I find sometimes easier to actually understand once you get to that step of like, here's the uncertainty. And in particular, I like this idea of sort of evaluating thresholds. So we can, which is sort of nice about this Bayesian framework, is that you can simulate directly from it, all sort of within this one comprehensive framework of fitting your model. Now you have your model, now you can actually simulate actual data, future data from that model, from drawing from that posterior distribution and then getting your own distribution. And then you're sort of free to play around with that, right? Like you're not hemmed into just one estimate and a CV, or one estimate and a confidence interval, and that's it. You can sort of look at different thresholds and sort of express that in terms of just probabilities of maybe exceeding that threshold. So with the current analysis, it's sort of building on what we did with the 2020 paper, where we sort of established the basic framework, added a few bells and whistles like hierarchical distance sampling, because now we have multiple species, so we can use hierarchical distance sampling to allow some sharing of information when we're fitting these distance sampling models. We also included a more rigorous model selection process, starting with a two-step analysis and sort of whittling down to the main number of covariates, and then having that subset of models that we further evaluate in the Bayesian framework with WAIC. I found that the negative binomial distribution was a better fit, and that Sigourney et al. We more looked at a Tweed distribution, just as another distribution that you can include in this framework. But we switched back over to sort of more of negative binomial. We evaluated 5 large whale species. Didn't really get into right whales here. They're sort of a separate category, so we kind of left them out of the mix. Jason's doing a lot of work on right whales, so we're kind of keeping them out of the mix for now, but focus on the other 5 large whale species. And now we can use these results and start applying them to wind energy areas. So in terms of the study sites, pretty large, covering the whole East Coast, from Halifax down to the tip of Florida there. More or less extends just beyond the EEZ, so out into some of the deep water. both shipboard and aerial surveys with 2 teams. So we had an upper and lower team for the shipboard surveys and a front team and a back team. So we can do mark recapture, distance sampling, helps us adjust for the probability detection on the track line. And then we divide the area up into 10 by 10 kilometer square units. Then we just enumerate the number of sightings within each one of those units, calculate your effort offset, that's just the amount of line transect effort in each one of those grid cells. Summarize the environmental variables. For the dynamic variables, we broke it up into 8-day averages, so basically weekly averages for the dynamic variables, and then interpolate if we had any missing grid cells with missing data. So here, these have kind of evolved over the time, but here we had 12 dynamic covariates and 8 static covariates. And most of these were important in at least one model, with the exception of SST fronts and chlorophyll fronts. So now that we have the model and we can fit it, now we can actually, again, use this and sort of whittle down on a particular wind energy area of interest. Being here in Long Island, I chose that as one to look at. For the purpose of this talk, I just combined these wind energy areas just into one big overall area. Again, these are just sort of subjective, subjective decisions. You assign those grid cells from our AMAPS grid cells to that area of interest, and then you can take a draw for each one of those grid cells and sum up to get the overall abundance, and then you repeat this, overall your sort of MC draws, and you can get your sort of posterior distribution of abundance within that area of interest. And then you can just look at different thresholds. I used potential biological removal, maybe not the most appropriate, but I just wanted to use something out there that had some sort of regulatory meaning. But again, this is completely arbitrary and sort of up to the user. But I think this is an area where maybe like stakeholders can come in and you can maybe evaluate different thresholds of interest. And then I repeat the process for each layer, for each one of those 8-day layers and each year. And overall, we had 12 years of covariate data. So results are still preliminary, still a little bit more vetting that needs to be done, but I don't expect things to change much. But here's just the different models, vary a little bit by species. Just some of the more common ones. Bottom temperature came up in quite a few of the models in terms of a dynamic, and then distance to the 1,000-meter isobath was a common static variable. And then Bayesian p-values, overall, I was pretty happy, especially if I'm going to simulate from these models. It's nice to know that when I simulate data, it looks like the actual data. So the pretty decent goodness of fit there with the Bayesian p-values. Just showing these real quick, just to show that, and then we can take that next step and make our density maps for the whole study site. I didn't do anything formal or quantitative here, but a quick sort of snapshot or eyeball. These were pretty consistent in terms of the distribution with some of the other stuff that we had done previously in the two-step framework. So distributions looked overall pretty good. And now finally we can narrow down and look at our wind energy area here for these different species of interest. So we can still look at abundance, right? We can still do our abundance with our uncertainty around that abundance, but now we can communicate that or translate that also into probabilities of exceeding these different thresholds and how that changes, over the course of a year. And then look at the sort of annual variability in that probability. Just real quickly, PBR, I couldn't find a good PBR for minke whale, so I just used the same as fin whale, so that's why that little star's up there. But it's kind of nice where, like, say with sei whales too, we have pretty high uncertainty in their estimates in say sort of winter, early spring, but the probability, we're pretty confident in the probability of exceeding that threshold. And then you get similar figures for humpback and sperm whales. So almost out of time here, so I'll just quickly wrap up. So finally, I have a working model here that I can apply to some of these species and make these maps and the results so far comparable to other studies. But we can also use this as an alternative or an additional approach of expressing uncertainty, especially in terms of maybe thresholds. I just sort of took this sort of an oldie but a goodie in contrast meaning in contrast to sort of traditional frequentist approaches. Conclusions presented in a Bayesian framework can be understood more easily by decision makers and by the public at large because these conclusions are presented in clear, familiar language. Not sure if I did that today, but that's the hope, that this is how these things can be applied. But one final warning, though, they are very computationally demanding. So, and there's many other techniques out there that I'm looking into myself. But so I'll end with that, and then Finally, a big thank you to all the people. There are lots of people putting a lot of hard work collecting these data and organizing these data, so a big thanks there. I think that's it.
All right, next up, we have a bit of a switch from your schedule, so Kate will be presenting next.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Kate Williams with Biodiversity Research Institute, and I'm going to be talking today about an effort that's gone on over the last few years to develop some guidance for monitoring the effects of offshore wind farms on marine birds. The guidance that's been developed is specifically focused on detecting changes in marine bird distributions and habitat use, so things like displacement and attraction, to help ensure that if there are behavioral effects from offshore wind, we're detecting them, and that those findings can really help inform decision-making around siting and mitigating future projects. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors from BRI and Fish and Wildlife Service and NYSERDA, who helped produce this presentation. So early on in the offshore wind development process in the US, New York State formed the Environmental Technical Working Group for Offshore Wind, which you've heard about this week. It includes developers with active leases, environmental nonprofit organizations, and state and federal agencies. And one of the goals of the ETWIG along the US Atlantic is to try to improve clarity in expectations and processes for wildlife monitoring and mitigation. And one of the ways that the ETWIG pursues this goal is by developing sort of specialist committees of experts who can develop guidance or other products and sort of feed them back up to the ETWIG, and from there to state regulators or other interested parties. So in May of 2022, we convened one of these committees to inform pre- and post-construction monitoring and research conducted at the scale of individual offshore wind projects. So in particular, we're trying to inform, primarily developer-funded monitoring aimed at detecting and characterizing displacement, attraction, and sort of macro to mesoscale avoidance of marine birds at offshore wind facilities in the US. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management does have existing guidance for developers for conducting avian site characterization surveys. So these are either boat-based or aerial surveys to inform the permitting process before offshore wind farms are actually built. But those guidelines don't really get into how to conduct surveys or other types of studies to actually detect effects to birds from offshore wind farms that are built. And so this committee was formed to help sort of clarify that scope and purpose of the existing BOEM guidelines, provide some specifics for how best to examine the effects of offshore wind facilities, such as displacement on marine birds, and then help try and standardize that type of effects research across individual wind farms so that hopefully we can better understand how these site-level effects might sort of translate into potential effects to populations or ecosystems. And so the hope is that this guidance that the committee developed can be, sort of referenced or incorporated into future national guidance developed by regulatory agencies. And in the immediate term, it can be used directly by offshore wind developers as they're sort of developing and implementing monitoring plans at that individual project scale. The committee is chaired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and includes 20 individuals with subject matter expertise on marine birds, study design, data collection, and offshore wind development. It includes many people at this conference, and so my co-authors and I would like to very much thank all of the specialist committee members. It was a volunteer committee, and people put an enormous amount of effort and expertise into getting this guidance drafted. So to begin, we conducted a literature review of existing empirical studies of displacement and avoidance. This is drawing from data from Europe. To try to understand potential sources of variation in marine bird responses to offshore wind development, and also to dig into aspects of study design that could influence statistical power. So things like whether the study was a before-after gradient design versus a before-after control impact design, for example. And we use the results of this review to inform many of the recommendations in the guidance document. The results of this review are in an appendix to the guidance document, so they're publicly available. Juliet Lamb also led a meta-analysis of this review, which she presented on earlier this week. The full draft guidance is pretty long. It's like 90 pages, so I'm just going to try and highlight a few things here. The document is intended, it provides a framework by which you can select a general study method, sort of driven by your key research questions and focal taxa, and then sort of hone in on an effective study design from there. We also include recommendations that are specific to observational surveys, which follow that same sort of broad framework that we laid out, but then really dives into more detail on boat-based and aerial surveys, since those are some of the key methods that are used for displacement studies. So one of the first steps in developing a study plan is to identify the research question or questions that your monitoring and research is going to address. And we really wanted to emphasize the need that all monitoring and research should be hypothesis-driven. We don't want to be collecting data for the sake of sort of checking a box for permitting. We need to be thinking about how that information can actually be used to answer questions. And so the committee developed a table of questions to focus on understanding whether changes in distributions and habitat use are occurring, at what magnitude and distance, how those changes may vary temporally, and whether there's other changes in behavior, like, for example, changes in foraging activity. There's also a question specific to nocturnal attraction, such as lighting, and then questions relating to understanding macro and mesoscale changes in movement behavior. And the idea in outlining these questions is that anyone using this guidance could select, one or more of those questions on which to sort of focus the study. The guidance then walks through the process of identifying focal taxa, which can occur either before or after selecting the key research question. Some types of studies, like observational surveys, can collect data across multiple species, obviously, but it was felt that there's still value in identifying focal taxa in these situations because it can help to identify or sort of inform key aspects of survey design. We developed a decision tree to help prioritize focal taxa. So, for example, if a species is highly exposed to the development area, there's more opportunity for effects from offshore wind to that taxon. Other criteria in the decision tree are, for example, related to statistical power. So if something's low abundance, you might have a hard time getting the necessary statistical power to detect an effect if one occurs, and also sensitivity. And so the idea is that you can use this decision tree to help sort of narrow down and select priority species. And then knowing what your questions are and having identified your focal taxa, the next step is to identify the best methods for study. And the committee considered 4 sort of categories of methods here. So observational surveys, individual tracking, remote and behavioral observations, and radar. And this section crosswalks the research questions with these general methods to try and help identify which methods are best suited to answer each question for different focal taxa, and sort of walks through detailed strengths and limitations of these various approaches. So the idea is that by this point in the guidance, you can sort of hone in on the best method available for your specific research question and focal taxon. And the committee really wants to make sure that studies are designed with adequate statistical power to detect effects. And so they're recommending the development of a study plan up front that includes key aspects of study design, like spatial and temporal scale, defining the data collections to be used, laying out up front what the data analysis plans are, so that the study is sort of designed and conducted appropriately for the chosen analysis approach. For the statisticians in the room, I think this all sounds super obvious, but from our review of existing studies from Europe, you would be surprised by the lack of clear and appropriate field methods as well as analytical methods. And so we wanted to very explicitly recommend that all of these aspects are being considered and evaluated up front. Likewise, standardized reporting of both methods and results is really important. We encountered some real challenges in reviewing existing effect studies, as Juliet talked about earlier this week. Many studies did not report pretty key information, like the actual study area that they were looking at, or uncertainty in results. And so standardization of reporting is super important, particularly to ensure that data collected at that sort of individual wind farm scale can be used to sort of inform a broader understanding. Also making data available in a timely manner was an important thing, and again, something that has been sort of a challenge. So the recommendations through to this point in the guidance are pretty high level and aimed at being method agnostic. Given that observational surveys are a key method for displacement studies around the globe, the committee also included some very detailed specifics on how to conduct offshore surveys in particular for marine birds. So things like what buffer sizes to consider, platform speed, surveyor qualifications, number of years in pre and post-construction surveys, some of that kind of thing, to really try and provide very clear feedback on how to conduct surveys to detect effects. I'm not going to go into super detail on these, happy to talk about them more, but we tried to be prescriptive about some things, but also include some level of flexibility, because everything sort of needs to be at least partially driven by the individual characteristics of that site as well. And then the final section of the document looks to the future. So in the short term, this is things like conducting some additional analyses to address unresolved study design questions. And I think Juliet Stepanuk will be touching on some of these ideas next. Also, developing approaches that could be implemented for projects that are adjacent or nearby lease areas, not sort of at that single project scale. And also developing a standing working group that can do things like maybe provide input on study plans or work on some of these other identified needs. And that's in progress actually through the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative with leadership from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So as I said at the beginning, the hope is that this guidance will be, sort of referenced or incorporated into future national guidance, and that it can be used directly by offshore wind developers and others as folks are developing and implementing monitoring plans at the project level. If you're interested, the draft guidance is publicly available at this QR code. The guidance went through actually multiple rounds of public feedback last year, and it should be publicly released this summer. And at the bottom of this same eTwig webpage, if you want, you can sign up for the eTwig mailing list and actually get notified when the document is released shortly. And with that, my co-authors and I would like to, again, thank all of the specialist committee members, and thanks also to our committee chair, Caleb Spiegel, and to Kate Press at NYSERDA for support and funding. Thanks.
And our final talk of this session will be given by Juliet Stepanuk, and please continue submitting and upvoting your questions for the discussion to follow this talk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Juliet Stepanuk. I'm a quantitative ecologist here at BRI, and I wanted to present some of the work that we've done assessing study design options for post-construction avian displacement in the New York Bight. I'd like to give a shout out and thank you to my co-authors and the funders as well. So post-construction monitoring is important to assess for marine birds, as Kate has very eloquently laid out, due to potential effects of offshore infrastructure for birds. This could include things like collision risk or displacement from wind farms. Now, there's demonstrated avoidance of wind farms by marine birds at multiple spatial scales that, when taken in aggregate, could lead to overall displacement or loss of habitat within the wind farm. Now, in Europe, this has been demonstrated during and after construction for a number of different species and taxa, including gannets, auks, and loons. There's a number of current guidance documents and requirements out there for conducting digital aerial surveys broadly. First and foremost is meeting COP approval requirements for the project at hand. And then there's also recommendations as Kate laid out from BOEM for site characterization, which includes 2 years of surveys conducted monthly, a buffer of at least 1 nautical mile, and minimum 10% coverage of the proposed area. Now, as Kate just mentioned, the eTwig draft guidance for post-construction monitoring for digital aerial surveys includes 2 years of pre-construction and 3 years of post-construction surveys, a recommendation of 12 to 16 surveys per year, a buffer of 4 to 20 kilometers, and minimum 20% spatial coverage. And so our question here was, what survey design is suitable to estimate population displacement in the lease area? This eTwig draft also recommends power analysis in order to assess various survey suitabilities. Now, baseline surveys, which have been conducted sort of broadly, provide information on the seasonal and annual presence of avian species in the lease area for the purposes of site characterization. But post-construction monitoring surveys should be designed in order to detect impacts of the construction and operations on avian species, specifically displacement. In addition, designing surveys with the statistical power to detect this change post-construction is important. And we're thinking that the site characterization survey approach was not considered in this context and would not be necessarily effective for the purposes of post-construction monitoring. So here we focused on the Empire Wind Lease area as a case study to test the efficacy of different survey configurations to detect macro displacement. Here on the right, you can see the Empire Lease area with the 2017 to 2018 baseline surveys that were conducted across this area. However, if we want to consider the configurations for a survey design for post-construction monitoring, there's a number of sort of axes we can consider. First is the percent coverage, which as you increase percent coverage, you can increase your detection of clumped or rare species and likely improve your density and displacement estimates. If you increase the survey frequency, so the number of times you're conducting the survey over a given time period, you could increase your detection of rare species. You could also increase your detection of species that have variable distributions through time, such as highly migratory species. Lastly, the survey buffer. Increases in survey buffer could lead to increased detection for species that undergo large displacements or species that are regularly found outside of the lease area. So here on the right, I've presented a number of different sort of configurations, and it comes down to the question of what combination of these survey design components has sufficient power to detect displacement and characterize density in a way that's feasible to execute. So for the purposes of our study here, I created a suite of survey designs that ranged from 5, 10, and 20% coverage, 1, 2, and 3 surveys per season, which corresponds to 4, 8, or 12 surveys per year, and a survey buffer of 4, 10, or 20 kilometers. In addition, we considered 3 focal taxa here, auks, gannets, and loons. Now, based on previous studies conducted in Europe, we decided to have auks displace to 1 kilometers, gannets displace outside of a 10-kilometer buffer, and loons displace outside of a 15-kilometer buffer from the lease area. Getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty here, we relied heavily on the NYSERDA and lease area-based digital aerial surveys, which we modeled with an inhomogeneous point process model using INLA and INLABRU in R. This incorporated a spatial random effect, sea surface temperature, and distance from shore to create a season and taxa-specific distribution output like you can see here on the right for northern gannets in the 3 seasons that we were able to model. Next, on the left, from the digital aerial surveys, we pulled out the expected sort of seasonal abundance of those different taxa. We also took the output of the distribution model and used that as an intensity layer in order to simulate points that represent locations of birds a bunch of times using a Matern clustering process. So at the end of the day, we used the maps on the right to simulate a bunch of birds across the space. This represents the baseline or pre-construction scenario. We then displaced 75% of the birds outside of the displacement regions, which vary, again, based on the different taxa, and redistributed those points based on their relative distribution. So more birds were distributed to areas that had higher baseline density outside of the lease area. This represents the post-construction or the displaced scenario. So here on the upper right, we have our baseline, and on the bottom right, we have our displaced, where there's fewer birds within that sort of buffered area. Both the pre- and post-displacement points were then detected by each survey design. And the power analysis that we ran relied on modified MRC and MRC power code in R, where we fitted models to both the pre- and post-displacement data layers to produce two different density surfaces using spatially adaptive smoothing splines or SALSA models. The variance in these two predicted density surfaces was bootstrapped and then was compared between the pre- and post-construction layers. And we determined that sufficient power was when statistically significant differences in these surfaces occurred in greater than 80% of these simulations. It's important to note that the MRC power output is actually on a per cell basis, so it's spatially explicit. But for the results I'm going to present today, we averaged the power across the lease area specifically. So I'm going to present a relatively confusing plot here, but it seems like a relatively good way to summarize these data in a digestible way. So each of the green points at the top is the average expected power to detect displacement in the lease area for a given survey design. Here, I'm just focusing on gannets, but we're going to broaden it out to the other taxa in a bit. So these points are the average power from each survey design. Down on the x-axis here, we increase our survey buffer, so 4, 10, 20, 4, 10, 20, 4, 10, 20, as you go across the x-axis. Here, our survey coverage repeats and increases, so you start low at 5% coverage and then increase your way to 20% survey coverage. Here, as you move along this bigger step, the survey frequency increases. And then this horizontal dashed line represents the power threshold of 0.8 that we discussed previously. So essentially, any of the green dots that fall above this 0.8 line, you can go and look at what that survey design configuration is and sort of assess and compare these different designs for their power output for each of the taxa. So, if we look at all three of our taxa here, we have auks on the left, gannets in the middle, loons on the right. You can see that there's a lot of variation between these different taxa, which is primarily based on their displacement distances, but could also have to do with their underlying distributions. Auks, which again we displaced 1 kilometer from the lease area, had sufficient power in all of the survey designs. So you can see all of those green dots are above that 0.8 threshold. Gannets get a little more interesting. We displaced them to 10 kilometers outside of the lease area, and here we find that survey buffer is particularly important, but that survey coverage also has some level of importance. But if you look at the sort of 3 chunks of lines here in the 3 segments, that's the survey frequency, and so we didn't find that there was as much to do with the frequency here. Loons, we displaced the furthest. We displaced them 15 kilometers. And here you can see that the 20-kilometer buffer is incredibly important, so that's sort of the third dot on each of these little lines here. That was incredibly important because it was bigger than the displacement area of the loons. And then there were various combinations of survey coverage and frequency that led to increases in power that led to sufficient survey designs. So in summary, we basically found that the buffer size, or the footprint, was the most important component to consider here. A minimum of 20 kilometers buffer was essentially required or was seen to be the best output, mostly due to the displacement of loons, which we said occurred at a relatively high distance. Both coverage and frequency had some sort of nuance to them, so the minimum coverage, the 5% coverage, and the smallest buffer options were not feasible across both gannets and loons. However, there were some options to trade off between coverage and frequency as needed. Importantly, what we found here is that these survey characteristics would meet the power threshold for this region specifically, assuming the goal is only detecting the displacement of the species that we prioritized here, gannets, loons, and auks. We did also run a density characterization to just sort of ensure that each of these survey designs were able to accurately show the density of these animals across space, and found that these were mostly suitable as well. So in conclusion, in the order of importance, the survey buffer should be larger than the maximum expected avian displacement for the focal taxa. The survey coverage, when you have higher coverage, it improves detections of all species, especially rare and clump species, thereby increasing the power. And higher survey frequencies can increase detections, especially for migratory species, increasing the power for some species. We also found that increasing the frequency of surveys improves the density characterization overall. It's important to note that these results will likely vary based on the underlying species distributions that you look at, the lease footprint size, and the geographic location that you're assessing. And this study demonstrates the importance of power analyses for PCM survey design and shows that power analysis can be used as an iterative tool to compare and assess survey design efficacy in a post-construction environment. Thank you.
I'll get all our speakers to come back up here and see if I can find Debbie.
Just send Debbie a quick note so that.
Hello.
Press and hold the red button.
All right. Well, we've got 2 working mics, so we'll call that good enough for now.
Oh, now it's working.
Nice. All right, let's start with, so we have 2 kind of related questions about turnbacks for Kelly. So have you explored the viability of random turnbacks as a way of estimating availability bias? And also, is it possible to run high defined in real time to provide a cue to circle back?
Okay, so the first question was about completing random circlebacks. Okay. We only thought about that in the context of the porpoise work. When we were thinking about the field methodology, and it was proposed that we could just circle back at random. But actually, I think that wouldn't be very effective, given that the scans survey, I think they only had 75 recaptures in their circlebacks out of 2,000 and odd porpoises for that whole area. So random circlebacks we thought wouldn't be very, very successful. In terms of using this methodology for seabird surveys, was that the question? Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
I think it was about high defined, whether it's possible to run that in real time.
Okay. Yes, so separate question. The AI that we've developed, it's currently, we don't use it real time. So it's ran after the surveys. We have thought about whether we could have it running real time for object detection. It's something that we are exploring now. The guy who's leading our AI work was horrified. He thinks it's a really ambitious thing to try and do, but we are actively exploring that, and it's really about the kind of processing power that's needed to make those real-time detections using that AI.
All right. And continuing on the aerial survey question, so I guess this is for both Debbie and Kelly. Is it noted if mammals are observed with fish schools or if other fish species are present with mammals during the surveys?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the real benefits of the digital aerial surveys, is that you capture everything on your footage. And at high def, we do routinely, we will mark any object, whether it be mammals, birds, anthropogenic activities, fishing boats, fishing buoys. It can all be marked on the footage. And yeah, we regularly see fish species, large fish like tuna, and we also see bait balls as well, and they are annotated in the footage. And yeah, if we can ID them, we will try, but it's very useful data to have.
Okay, and Debbie, do you want to answer that as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, since she discussed the shipboard or the aerial with the images, really for the aerial for visual, trying to add in that extra piece of information is not always recorded, especially small fish. But in terms of the surveys that we do, we usually do record larger fish like tunas and that as a regular sighting. Is that what the question was about?
Yes, that was, thank you. All right, next question is for Doug. You mentioned that your results are comparable to others. Could you expand on that in terms of point estimates and variance relative to those by Roberts et al.? Is the intention to eventually transition to this Bayesian approach?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, primarily, again, I didn't do anything quantitative. It was sort of an eyeball thing, but I do have some of Jason's older, some of his older models. And so quick look at that, again, in the general ballpark. And more specifically though, for our final reports, every 5 years, we submit a final report to BOEM. And most of those models were using that two-step approach, so similar to Jason's models, but using just the AMAPS data, so more comparable, because basically same data set. So that's what I was referencing. Sorry I didn't provide more details, but I was referencing those models that actually my co-author Sam Chavez worked a lot on those. So just sort of eyeballing it to them. I will say again, it deserves maybe a little bit more investigation. They do tend to be slightly larger, but it's again the density is it's an unobservable state, so we don't really know who's right. We know what we saw, but we don't know the actual densities out there. But within within I don't know, I can't 10%ish range of how close those densities are. So. In terms of transitioning over, probably no. We're kind of, definitely finishing up what I'm doing now. I think it's, obviously there's a lot more other species out there. I just applied these to the large whale species. Just the time, and now we're getting, we have more data. It's really time consuming. So sort of my future work, I'm actually kind of considering maybe transitioning that to more sort of like what was presented with the Inlabrews type models that can still sort of propagate that uncertainty, have that hierarchical structure, but can maybe run a little bit faster than the Bayesian models.
All right. Next, we have a question for Kate. Can the methods recommended to detect displacement of marine birds be adapted to other avian groups, such as shorebirds?
Yeah, I mean, observational surveys are typically not an ideal method for studying non-marine birds. You do pick up a wide variety of other species, but it's more sort of incidental. Some of the other methods that we discuss in the guidance, so individual tracking, radar, some types of behavioral observations are probably a better approach for looking at shorebird behavioral change offshore. And the overall framework of the guidance in terms of like identifying research questions and focal taxa and methods that will match your questions and trying to work through that process of developing a study design with adequate statistical power, I think you could apply pretty universally.
One more question for you while you have the mic. Any thoughts about displacement guidance for non-boat or aerial survey methods?
Yeah, that's definitely a topic of interest. I think the RWSC Bird and Bat Subcommittee, as I mentioned, Fish and Wildlife Service is sort of spinning up a I don't know, a subcommittee, like a working group within the bird and bat subcommittee that is going to continue working on sort of behavioral change, displacement, attraction related topics. I don't know that it's totally defined yet exactly like what the group's going to focus on. I think we're all still trying to figure out what the priorities are. But certainly one of the things on the list is like detailed guidance like we develop for surveys could be really useful for some of these other study methods as well. So I would imagine that's one of the things we'll be discussing as a potential focus area in the next couple years.
All right. Next, we have a question for Julia. How did the average initial density of birds affect the output? And was there a minimum density needed to detect change regardless of other parameters in your surveys? Yeah, how did the initial density of birds affect your output?
That's a good question. So we found that for some of the species, we've looked at a variety of configurations since this sort of case study. And when the abundance is lower, you do have to make some adjustments in terms of coverage and frequency in order to accommodate for just the ability to even detect low-density species. And so what we chose and the large sort of spatial area that we focused on allowed us to be a little bit more flexible in sort of the survey design configurations that would be appropriate. But that is definitely, we've found, conditional on the size of the footprint overall.
And one more question for you. In Europe, we find that some species are attracted to wind farms rather than avoid them, such as cormorants and shags. We found that in displacement analysis as well. Are you looking at some of those impacts as well, and how do you rate this or measure this effect?
We are not. I would like to. That would be really cool. I did have a misplaced negative sign the first time I ran this, and all of the gannets went towards the wind farm. So that was an interesting learning experience for me. But yeah, I definitely think that there's opportunities within the statistical framework to look at things like that. It's just sort of quantifying the idea of like how many and how far do they go, and sort of setting up those parameters on the front end to be able to come up with something sort of realistic on the back end.
All right. Another question for Kelly. You mentioned your estimates of the proportion at the surface being much higher than the tag data indicate. How did estimates of the proportion visible, including submerged but visible, compare?
So from the PALM analysis, it was 27% of harbour porpoises estimated at the surface. From the telemetry data from Jonas Thielman in the North Sea, those estimates are suggesting that the tag porpoises were at the surface for between 4 and 10% of the time. So that's lower than we're getting out of the cluster capture-recapture model. I suspect it's because the model is also using submerged animals as well. So actually that estimation of availability is not purely about animals that are at the surface. Some of them are submerged. And, you know, again, from Thielman, from the tag porpoises, it suggests about 40 to 70% of the time porpoises were in that top 2 meters. So I think that higher 27% from this data set is perhaps capturing porpoises that are subsurface as well.
Which is one of the cool things about digital aerial surveys, is that you're seeing down into the water column a little bit, so you're detecting, like same with turtles, you're detecting those animals that are just subsurface a little bit more easily, I think, than you can with some other survey methods. And
the guys at Auckland Uni, they think that they maybe have to do some more adjustment to the statistical framework to kind of cope with that. So watch this space. That's for them to do.
Okay, and one more question for you, Kelly. Can you please expand a bit on the statistical approach and how availability bias can be corrected without capture histories using the following platform?
You want me to expand on the statistical?
Yes, they're asking for a little bit of information on how you correct for availability bias using availability bias.
Okay, so I'm not a statistician, so there's very much, have a look at Ben's paper there for a description of the method in detail. But we do use the key information from the two planes. The distances from the start of the survey to each detection from both planes. And then it looks at the distances and kind of see if they form clusters. So it's that spacing between the detections which defines the clusters. And where those distances are tighter, then those detections are more likely to be of the same individual. And where they're not, more likely to be separate individuals. So as I understand it, it's that information which is key for informing that availability parameter. Sorry, please read Ben's paper.
All right. And this question was posed to Julia, but I think I'll expand it to the whole group since I think this is kind of an opportunity for discussion among the group, which is how do you kind of account for the cost-benefit trade-offs in terms of doing more intensive surveys or greater frequency or larger areas versus the obvious increased cost of doing that? And I think that also applies to sort of correcting for bias. Like what kind of recommendations do you make about weighing cost versus benefit?
Yeah, I would say sort of pulling from what Kate presented, the idea of thinking about if you are going to go and put all of this financial investment in this kind of monitoring, making sure that it's designed in a way that is scientifically appropriate for further analysis and for answering the kind of scientific question that you have would allow that sort of financial investment to go farther in terms of getting a useful output. With that, the recommendation to do these kinds of power analyses and preemptive sort of investments and assessing what is best and where you can make trade-offs. Like the results of the case study that I did showed that there were trade-offs in frequency and coverage. So if there's a financial difference there where maybe you could leverage one or the other, that allows you to have a little bit more flexibility but still have the scientific sort of confidence that you'll be able to collect sufficient data to do the kind of work that you need to do.
See, Debbie, do you have anything to contribute as far as sort of cost versus sort of frequency and coverage?
Yeah, I guess another way to look at it is that if the correction factor that you're spending extra time, extra money on is doubling your abundance estimate, for example, then that probably is more financially, or it's more important to spend the money to do that if you need the absolute abundance estimates. And so, like you said, there's always this trade-off between, and it's also species specific. So, I mean, I think that's what another factor to consider is how much more animals you're getting for the number of dollars you're putting in.
Others?
I guess I would say, talking, I guess, using surveys as an example, if you are going to design a survey with adequate statistical power to detect change for some of these species like loons, you need a big buffer size and it's going to be expensive. But I think it is worth asking if you do, say, a smaller buffer size, like, it's sort of throwing money away. Like if you're gonna do it right so that you actually have the power to detect change. I think one of the things that there's a lot of interest in is trying to figure out whether there's a way to conduct surveys a little bit more collectively. So rather than having this all be individual wind farm by wind farm, which is really inefficient, it's more expensive, and you're less likely to actually be able to detect change than if you're doing it at a regional scale. You know, it's really hard to do that type of coordination across projects. Projects are all in different sort of development stages, and there's a variety of barriers there. But if we can get to a sort of more regional scale survey where multiple developers are paying into, you know, sort of a common survey effort, I think we would end up with a better scientific product, and it would be more efficient and actually cheaper for everyone involved. So I think that's kind of the long-term goal, but we're not we're not there sort of organizationally at the moment.
Can I just add to that? I mean, that is an approach that we have done in some areas in the UK. So off northeast Scotland in the Firth of Forth, the developers are working together and have been doing larger scale regional surveys. So there's obviously the benefits that you point out in terms of the logistics and costs of doing that. But I think also this is a cluster of three wind farms, another wind farm potentially coming on board. And I think collecting the data across all of them really helps as well in understanding those displacement effects that you talk about, because they're at different stages of development. Some are already operational, others are coming on board later, and having that regional scale picture really helps, I think, to see how there's combined effects from these wind farms that are relatively close in space.
Definitely, yeah. Some of the best studies from Europe, like in the German part of the North Sea, are doing something similar, where they're surveying the entire region, and as new wind farms come online, you can see these differences in distributions and how they're sort of compounding. And Juliet talked about this in her talk earlier this week, where that larger spatial scale of surveys makes you much more able to sort of reliably detect change that's occurring.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just quickly add, and I don't want to be redundant, but yeah, I mean, it's hard to get away from data. It's hard to estimate something with nothing. But think about what's out there, and this has already been said. What data sets are already out there, and what methods are out there that help us combine those data sets into estimates? And the Bayesian in me says, what prior information do we already have before we get started? And then sort of do your analysis and see, well, what more do we need? But I'd like to see more of these cost benefits and sort of simulating and say, okay, what level of uncertainty can we live with, and what information do we already have to inform us?
Yeah, I'd also say, thinking about this in the context of change, when you look at the broad baseline surveys that have been conducted, something like the NYSERDA surveys, look at how prolific those have been used throughout this entire set of presentations throughout the week so far. Those are going to age out eventually, and the system is changing. So thinking about this in this time frame, as we need to start sort of looking forward into the future and considering the fact that these ecosystems are changing, it's sort of important to consider how such a useful sort of broad baseline kind of effort could be approached again in the future.
And I was thinking the costs kind of go beyond the surveys themselves to all the post-processing, especially for these, computationally intensive techniques or photo surveys where you have to then go back and classify, and to data storage and data sharing, and all those things have time costs as well as money costs that have to be kind of factored in. All right, I think we're at time now, but let's give another round of applause to everyone. Thank you for a great session.